5. The two central difficulties of the novel, both of which may at first appear purely technical, are still to be considered. They have to do with the choice of the point from which the subject is to be seen, and with the attempt to produce on the reader the effect of the passage of time. Both may appear purely technical, but even were it possible to draw a definite line between the technique of a work of art and its informing spirit, the points in question go too deep to be so classed. They are rooted in the subject, and, as always, in the last issue, the subject itself determine and limit their office. It was remarked in the chapter on the short story that the same experience never happens to any two people, and that the storyteller's first care, after the choice of a subject, is to decide to which of his characters the episode in question happened, since it could not have happened in that particular way to more than one. Applied to the novel, this may seem a hard saying, since the longer passage of time and more crowded field of action presuppose, on the part of the visualizing character, a state of omniscience and omnipresence likely to shake the reader's sense of probability. The difficulty is most often met by shifting the point of vision from one character to another in such a way as to comprehend the whole history and yet preserve the unity of impression. In the interest of this unity, it is best to shift as seldom as possible, and to let the tale work itself out from not more than 2, or at most 3, angles of vision, choosing as reflecting consciousness persons either in close mental or moral relation to each other, or discerning enough to estimate each other's parts in the drama, so that the latter, even viewed from different angles, always presents itself to the reader as a whole. The choice of such reflectors is not easy. Still more arduous is the task of determining at what point each is to be turned on the scene. The only possible rule seems to be that when things happen which the first reflector cannot, with any show of probability, be aware of, or is incapable of reacting to, even if aware, then another, an adjoining consciousness is required to take up the tale. Thus, dryly stated, the formula may seem pedantic and arbitrary, but it will be found to act of itself in the hands of the novelist, who has so let his subject ripen in his mind that the characters are as close to him as his own flesh. To the novelist who lives among his creations in this continuous intimacy, they should pour out their tale almost as if to a passive spectator. The problem of the coordinating consciousness has visibly disturbed many novelists, and the different solutions attempted are full of interest and instruction. Each is, of course, but another convention, and no convention is in itself objectionable, but becomes so only when wrongly used, as dirt, according to the happy definition, is only matter in the wrong place. Verisimilitude is the truth of art, and any convention which hinders the illusion is obviously in the wrong place. Few hinder it more than the slovenly habit of some novelists of tumbling in and out of their characters' minds, and then suddenly drawing back to scrutinize them from the outside as the avowed showman holding his puppet strings. All the greatest modern novelists have felt this, and sought, though often half unconsciously, to find a way out of the difficulty. The most interesting experiments made in this respect have been those of James and Conrad, to both of whom, though in ways how different, the novel was always by definition a work of art, and therefore worthy of the creator's utmost effort. James sought the effect of verisimilitude by rigorously confining every detail of his picture to the range, and also to the capacity, of the eye fixed on it. In The Cage is a curiously perfect example of the experiment on a small scale, only one very restricted field of vision being permitted. In his longer and more eventful novels, where the transition from one consciousness to another became necessary, he contrived it with such unfailing ingenuity that the reader's visual range was continuously enlarged by the substitution of a second consciousness whenever the boundaries of the first were exceeded. The Wings of the Dove gives an interesting example of these transitions in The Golden Bowl. Still unsatisfied, still in pursuit of an impossible perfection, he felt he must introduce a sort of coordinating consciousness, detached from, but including the characters principally concerned. The same attempt to wrest dramatic forms to the uses of the novel that caused The Awkward Age to be written in dialogue seems to have suggested the creation of Colonel and Mrs. Assingham as a sort of Greek chorus to the tragedy of The Golden Bowl. This insufferable and incredible couple spend their days in espionage and delation, and their evenings in exchanging the reports of their eavesdropping with a minuteness and precision worthy of Scotland Yard. The utter improbability of such conduct on the part of a dull-witted and frivolous couple in the lush of London society shows that the author created them for the sole purpose of revealing details which he could not otherwise communicate, without lapsing into the character of the mid-Victorian novelist chatting with his readers of my heroine, in the manner of Thackeray and Dickens. Convention for convention, and both are bad. James is perhaps even more unsettling to the reader's confidence than the old-fashioned intrusion of the author among his puppets. Both ought to be avoided, and may be, as other great novels are there to prove. Conrad's preoccupation was the same, but he sought to solve it in another way, by creating what someone has aptly called a Hall of Mirrors, a series of reflecting consciousness, all belonging to people who are outside of the story but accidentally drawn into its current and not, like the Assinghams, forced into it for the sole purpose of acting as spies and eavesdroppers. The method did not originate with Conrad. In the most perfectly composed of all short stories, Le Grand Bretaché, Balzac showed that depth, mystery, and verisimilitude may be given to a tale by causing it to be reflected in fractions in the minds of a series of accidental participants or mere lookers-on. The relator of the tale, casually detained in a provincial town, is struck by the ruinous appearance of one of its handsomest houses. He makes his way into the deserted garden, and is at once called on by a solicitor who informs him that, according to the will of the lately deceased owner, no one is to be permitted on the premises till 50 years after his death. The visitor, whose curiosity is naturally excited, next learns from the landlady of his inn that, though she has never known the exact facts of the tragedy, she knows there has been one, and that a person whom she suspects of having played a part in it is actually lodged under her roof. From the landlady, the narrator carries his inquiries to the maidservant of the inn, who has been in the service of the dead lady, and who confides to him the dreadful scenes of which she has helped in horror-struck witness. And, grouping with these fragments in his own more comprehending mind, he finally gives them to the reader in their ghastly completeness. Even George Meredith, whose floods of improvisation seem to have been so rarely hampered by any concern as to the composition of his novels, was now and then visibly perplexed by the question of how to pass from the mind of one character to another without too violent a jolt to the reader. In one instance, in one of those big scenes which, as George Eliot said, write themselves, he attempted, probably on the spur of the moment, a solution which proved admirably successful for that particular occasion. In the memorable talk in the course of which the inarticulate Rhoda Fleming and her tongue-tied suitor finally discover themselves to each other, the novelist, to show how tongue-tied both were, and yet convey the emotion beneath their halting monosyllables, hit on the device of putting in parentheses after each phrase what the speaker was actually thinking. It is one of the great pages of the book, yet even in the enchantment of first reading it one is aware of admiring a mere acrobatic feat, a sort of breathless chassé-croisé, which could not have been kept up for another page without straining the reader's patience and his sense of likelihood. Meredith was a genius, and his instinct for effect made him, at a crucial moment, stumble on a successful trick. But, because he was a genius, he did not prolong or repeat it. The reason why such sudden changes from one mind to another are fatiguing and disillusioning was summed up, though for a different purpose, in a vivid phrase of George Eliot's. It is in the chapter of Middlemarch, which records the talk between Dorothy and Celia Brooke, after the latter's first meeting with the austere and pompous Mr. Casaubon, whom her elder sister so unaccountably admires. The frivolous Celia is profoundly disappointed. She finds Mr. Casaubon very ugly. Dorothy, at this, haltingly lets drop that he reminds her of the portrait of Locke. Celia, had Locke those 2 white moles with hair on them? Dorothy, oh, I dare say, when people of a certain sort looked at him. That answer sums up the whole dilemma. Before beginning his tale, the novelist must decide whether it is to be seen through eyes given to noting white moles, or to discovering the visionary butterflylet on faces so disfigured. He cannot have it both ways and still hope to persuade his reader. The other difficulty is that of communicating the effect of the gradual passage of time in such a way that the modifying and maturing of the characters shall seem not an arbitrary sleight of hand, but the natural result of growth in age and experience. This is the great mystery of the art of fiction. The secret seems incommunicable. One can only conjecture that it has to do with the novelist's own deep belief in his characters and what he is telling about them. He knows that this and that befell them, and that in the interval between this and that the months and years have continued their slow task of erosion or accretion, and he conveys this knowledge by some subterranean process as hard to seize in action as the growth of a plant. A study of the great novelists, and especially Balzac, Thackeray, and Tolstoy, will show that such changes are suggested, are arrived at, in the inconspicuous transitional pages of narrative that lead from climax to climax. One of the means by which the effect is produced is certainly that of not fearing to go slowly, to keep down the tone of the narrative, to be as colorless and quiet as life often is in the intervals between its high moments. Another difficulty connected with this one is that of keeping so firm a hold on the main lines of one's characters that they emerge modified and yet themselves from the ripening or disintegrating years. Tolstoy had this gift to a supreme degree. Whenever in the dense forest of War and Peace, a character reappears, often after an interval so long that the ear has almost lost the sound to which he rhymes. He is at once recognized as the same, profoundly the same, yet scored by new lines of suffering and experience. Natasha grows into the fat, slovenly mère de famille of the last chapters, is incredibly like and yet different to the phantom of delight who first captivated Prince Andrew and the prince himself. In those incomparable pages devoted to his long illness, where one watches the very process of dematerialization, the detachment from earthly things happening as naturally as the fall of a leaf, is the same as the restless and unhappy man who appears with his pathetic, irritating little wife at the evening party of the first chapter. Becky Sharp, Arthur Pendennis, Dorothy Casaubon, Lydgate, Charles Bovary, with what sure and patient touches their growth and declines are set forth, and how mysteriously yet unmistakably, as they reappear after each interval, the sense is conveyed that there has been an interval, not in moral experience only, but in the actual lapse of the seasons. The producing of this impression is indeed the central mystery of the art. To its making go patience, meditation, concentration, all the quiet habits of mind now so little practiced, so seldom inculcated, and to these must be added the final imponderable genius, without which the rest is useless, and which, conversely, would be unusable without the rest.